Every criminal organization has names everybody remembers. Then there are names people don't talk about. The names that never seem to be front and center. The names that quietly appear in court records, newspaper archives, Supreme Court opinions, and investigative files. For me, that name was Ruth Chancey. When I started this journey, I wasn't even looking for Ruth Chancey. I was investigating Georgia's first major RICO prosecution after covering the Dexter Williams case. That search led me to Walton County. Walton County led me to Harold Chancey. Harold Chancey led me to the Thomas family. And every time I thought I had reached the center of the story, I found myself right back at Ruth Chancey. Now, before we go any further, I want to make something clear. This episode isn't built on rumors. It isn't built on folklore. It's built on court records, newspaper archives, appellate decisions, interviews, and public documents. One source that deserves credit is the Red Clay Podcast. Whether you agree with every conclusion they reached or not, they compiled extensive historical material that pointed me toward records I may not have found otherwise. But I didn't stop there. I went back to the public record myself. And that's where the story started changing. Because depending on who you ask, Ruth Chancey was two completely different people. I've interviewed people who remember her as the sweetest woman they've ever met, a woman who always had hard candy for children, a woman who looked almost like your grandmother, someone who welcomed people with a smile. But I've also heard another name, Ruthless Ruth, a woman people respected, a woman whose name carried weight, a woman who, according to many who lived around Walton County, wasn't someone you wanted to cross. Stories are one thing, so I went looking for documented events. The first one took me back into the late 1960s, during a time when Georgia law enforcement was aggressively cracking down on illegal liquor operations and public nuisances. The state moved against one of Ruth Chancey's businesses through a padlock injunction. Now think about the timing. Just miles away in neighboring Jackson County, District Attorney Floyd Hoard had been assassinated while trying to dismantle organized crime. The GBI was pouring resources into Northeast Georgia. Law enforcement was under enormous pressure, yet Ruth Chancey fought the state. She hired Richard B. Russell III, one of Georgia's most respected attorneys. The case went all the way to Georgia Supreme Court, and she won. Now, that's not speculation, that's part of the public record. Okay? And then we move into 1976, 3 weeks before the Thomas family fire. Ruth Chancey contacted independent insurance agent John Van Cott. According to the record, she increased the insurance coverage on the Monroe rental property from $20,000 to $40,000. She also increased the coverage on another rental property she owned in nearby Statham. No document reason was given for the increase. Then came the night of October 10th, 1976. Within just a few hours, both houses were burning. One of those fires claimed the lives of 5 children. James and Jeanette Thomas survived with severe burns. State Fire Marshal investigator John Yearwood examined the scene. His conclusion was clear: the Thomas fire was an arson. Investigators also determined that the Statham fire had striking similarities. Gasoline cans were recovered at both locations. The evidence suggested the two fires were connected. Then something happened that made me stop reading and start asking questions. According to the public record, Ruth Chancey contacted State Fire Marshal Yearwood. Her question wasn't about the children. It wasn't about the investigation. It wasn't about who might have committed the crime. She wanted to know, why were you holding up my money? Now stop and think about that. 5 children had just been killed. An active arson investigation was underway. The insurance policies had been increased only weeks before, yet the conversation had already turned to insurance proceeds. And according to historical record, the insurance money was ultimately paid. Now ask yourself, how often does that happen? An arson investigation, 5 children dead, the property owner receives the insurance proceeds. That's not my opinion. That's documented sequence of events. Now then came the indictments. Harold Chancey, Bobby Jean Ghostwick, and Ruth Chancey, 3 defendants. One of the biggest criminal prosecutions in Georgia history. But then something changed. Ruth Chancey's case was separated from the others. She never stood trial alongside her son, Harold Chancey, and Bobby Jean Ghostwick. According to historical record, prosecutor later cited her severe illness as the reason she was never prosecuted. Yet Ruth Chancey lived until December 16, 2008, more than 2 decades after those proceedings. Now, I'm not here to tell you what that means. I'm here to tell you what the paper trail shows. a woman who defeated the state of Georgia before the Georgia Supreme Court, a woman connected to rental properties whose insurance coverages were increased shortly before properties burned, a woman who demanded to know why her insurance money was being delayed while investigators were calling the fire an arson, a woman whose insurance proceeds were ultimately paid, a woman who was indicted, a woman whose case was severed, a woman who was never tried. Now, standing alone, each one of those events may have its own explanation, but when you put them together, you begin to understand why people still talk about Ruth Chancey nearly 50 years later. Was she the godmother of the Dixie Mafia? I can't answer that. History has attached that labels in some circles, and many people in Walton County has repeated it over the years. But I can tell you is this. Every road I travel in this investigation, every interview, every appellate opinion, every newspaper clipping, every court record keeps leading me back to the same woman, Ruth Chancey. And whether history remembers her as a kind grandmother or remembers her as Ruthless Ruth, one thing cannot be ignored. Her influence is impossible to overlook when you follow the public record. And that's why I call this the unspoken power of the godmother. Because sometimes the most powerful people in the room is the one who never raises their voice to speak. This is Lamar King Sr., investigative analyst, new media, where the truth will never be silenced. Be great today. Peace.